Know that I am no more adjudicator than I am a servant to the law that governs us all. Let tonight's proceedings serve as a reminder to our community that we must adhere to the code that binds our society, lest we endanger all of our blood. Forgive me. Let the penalty commence.
Vampire: The Masquerade Bloodlines is a 2004 role-playing video game developed by Troika Games and published by Activision. Set in White Wolf Publishing's world of darkness, it is based on the tabletop role-playing game Vampire: The Masquerade and follows a human who is killed and revived as a fledgling vampire. The game depicts the player's journey through Los Angeles to uncover the truth behind a recently discovered relic that heralds the end of all vampires. The player assigns their character to one of several vampire clans, each with unique powers, customizes their combat and dialogue abilities, and progresses through bloodlines using violent and non-violent methods. The selection of clan affects how the player is perceived in the game world and which powers and abilities they possess. This opens up different avenues of exploration and methods of interacting with or manipulating other characters. The development of Bloodlines began in November 2001. The developers wanted to put a role-playing game in a first-person setting, believing that the genre had become stale. Troika approached publisher Activision with its idea. Activision suggested using the Vampire: The Masquerade license used a year earlier in Nihilistic Software's Vampire: The Masquerade Redemption, which had experienced sufficient success to merit a sequel. Instead of developing a sequel to Redemption, the development team researched the White Wolf property, including the game's rules and storylines. Troika was a small game studio with 5 developers and a total staff of 32. Troika wanted to make a 3D game, but was uncertain whether to build a new game engine or license an existing one, and whether to use first or third person. At that time, the source game engine was being built by Valve. Valve employee Scott Lynch approached Troika about using the engine. They would be the first external team to use it. Troika chose Source for its facial animation and lip-syncing system since it wanted players to speak to the characters face-to-face. Since the engine was in development with Bloodlines and Valve's own Half-Life 2, Troika was working with unfamiliar code and tools, forcing it to write code to compensate for the unfinished engine, and with only a single source of technical support. Troika developed a lighting system to create distinctive, moody illumination for the nighttime setting, a particle system for the special effects accompanying the vampire disciplines, and a cloth system for clothing flow. Source lacked its later artificial intelligence coding, and Troika's code worked poorly with the Source engine. Troika co-founder Jason Anderson's research on Vampire: The Masquerade source material and fan sites found that the game's main attraction was character interaction and involvement in the vampire societies, not statistics and powers. The game's original score was composed and produced by Rick Schaefer. Troika licensed many songs for the game, and posters for real bands are featured on the walls of the game's clubs. The soundtrack was released as a limited edition CD to customers who pre-ordered the game through Best Buy. Troika tried to remain faithful to the pen and paper role-playing game, hoping not to alienate the game's fans. But rules designed for multiple players did not translate well to single-player computer game design. The team attempted to discover which elements could work equally well in pen and paper and computer games. However, although much of the character system and attributes were translated, not all the attributes, such as knowledge of lore, made sense in the computer game. Of 30 pen and paper abilities, 15 reached the final design.
White Wolf liked the story, but they're like, you can't use Cain in the story. Not you, the original vampire. You can't use Cain.
How do you know they're not the same thing?
I know. So we rewrote the story, and we wrote a story that I thought was still pretty good, but there was something missing. There was something in the first story that I really liked that this was lacking. And so we wrote that story and we started working on it. And then a couple months later, I think it was a couple months later, they came back to us and they're like, oh, we're doing the whole Gehenna thing. We're basically rebooting you can do whatever you want. And we're like, oh. So then we kind of merged the two different stories together and we kind of came up with a hybrid between them, which I think was better than either one.
To balance the clans, the aristocratic Ventru were only allowed to feed on noble blood, though this was changed to allow them to feed on lower-class humans, receiving less blood. During character creation, the game had an optional character biography with unique positive and negative characteristics, increasing one ability while limiting another. This was removed from the released game. Activision felt there was insufficient test time, and removing it was a more stable option. Choice is a significant aspect of the game, requiring a non-linear design to accommodate the customized characters. Level design began with a list of factors such as disciplines, stealth, and feats. Each area had to be viable for a shooting character, sufficient ammunition, a discipline-focused character, sufficient blood sources to keep the powers fueled, and a melee specialist, able to reach enemies without being killed, with stealth options and various combinations. Level design began with a focus on stealth, considering the positioning of guards and the character's potential stealth capability at that point in the game. Then direct, combat-heavy, and dialogue paths were added. The amusement arcade area was to feature playable versions of Activision arcade games such as Pitfall. Though the idea was abandoned due to time constraints, director Leonard Boyarsky considered the animation system important in the team's choice of the source engine. The integrated Face Poser tool allowed Troika to customize facial animations, expressions, gestures, and lip syncing, eliminating the need to explain what a character was doing. Every non-player character required a voiceover, which helped Troika define its characters more quickly. Although Troika had ignored first-person engines due to technical limitations, such as a low polygon count and limited texture memory, as the technology improved, they thought that with Vampire that they could create a real-time action game without sacrificing the immersion and story of a role-playing game. After delays and further development tweaks, the final game would have only 3 weeks of testing to become the final release code. The game was still unfinished when Activision forced its release. Bloodlines creative director Jason Anderson blamed Activision, saying that the publisher took the game from Troika without providing enough time to test and polish it. Conversely, Boyarsky defended Activision for supporting Troika as the project had exceeded its budget and schedule.
It was just really, really tough development. I mean, because it was really hard for us to use the engine. It was hard for us to do what we were trying to do in the engine. I did, like I said, I kind of oversaw the writing. I did some writing, not too much on that, but I oversaw it and edited a lot of it, made sure everything was working together. I did concept art, I did paintings.
And I remember I thought I was going to be involved.
Mapping.
I thought I was going to be involved more because after Temple went out and we did the patches and then Atari finally said no more patches. I mean, we literally weren't allowed to do another patch. I thought, great, I can devote, and also my kidney stone probably finally popped out after 4 months.
Yeah.
I was like, great, I can devote myself full time. And that's when Sharon said, because I think Sharon and Jason had their third child. And she basically said, I need to step away. And so I had to take over HR and the accounting, doing the books. I remember her walking me through, here's how QuickBooks work. And I'm like,
right.
wow. I was like, I had one high school accounting class. So I started doing that, and that took up time I would have spent on Vampire. So I kind of felt bad, but I'm like, there's a business being run underneath all this. And I could tell you were under a lot of pressure, and there was literally nothing anyone could do to deflect.
Yeah, it was tough. I put on a lot of weight. I was really depressed. Finally we hired our own AI programmer because we just couldn't. We had to show some progress. So in effect, we took the Half-Life engine and finished our version of it, which of course was never going to be anywhere near as good as Half-Life's.
Yeah, but the thing that frustrated me the most was the version that shipped had everybody sliding around, which literally didn't exist on the build the day before or the build the day after. But they just went, we called them up and said, hey, we've got the new build to send you. And they're like, no, don't bother. We already sent it to the duplicator. And I was like, but the opening cinematic is.
I might have lost my mind with them on the phone at that point when I found out they were doing that. That was not something that I was really happy about.
Activision obtained model Erin Lane to play Jeanette in promotional material for the game. Lane worked with Bloodlines artist Tim Bradstreet for a day to provide the poses chosen by Activision to represent Jeanette in the game's posters, clothing, and other items. Released in competition with Half-Life 2 and several other titles, Bloodlines sold fewer than 80,000 copies during its initial release, which was considered poor. It divided critics at the time. Although they praised the game's writing and scale of choice, they criticized its technical flaws. It was Troika Games' last production before its closure in 2005. The game has a cult following as a rarely replicated example of gameplay and narrative. Many RPG fans now recognize it as a flawed masterpiece. Since its original release, Bloodlines received post-release support from fans, supplying unofficial fixes and adding unused content. A sequel, Vampire: The Masquerade Bloodlines 2, is currently in development.